Hello, everyone, and welcome to the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights virtual program on the Fair Chance and Housing Act. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you all know how to participate in today's event. If you experience any technical difficulties tonight, please explain your problem through the chat feature by messaging me directly, and I will try my best to address the issue. Please note, as an audience, you have access to drop questions in the Q&A tab, and you have the option to submit questions anonymously. All audience members' cameras and microphones will be off as well. Due to time constraints, please keep all questions on topic. Please note that questions we do not get to this evening will be answered as a follow-up after the event. You may also email us at communityrelations@njcivilrights.gov. Resource links and contact information will be shared in the chat throughout the program. If you experience any technical difficulties tonight, please explain your problem through the chat feature, and we will try our best to address the issue. Lastly, please subscribe to New Jersey OAG on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest information on news, resources, and information from our office. You can also find the Division on Civil Rights on Facebook and Twitter at Civil Rights NJ. Now I'd like to hand things off to our first speaker, Dr. Denalery Johnson Fennell.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Greetings. I am Dr. Denalery Johnson Fennell, Chief of Outreach and Community Relations. Together, we stand united on Lenni Lenape Native land in support of racial justice, the intersection of housing, health, and wealth equity, as well as the well-being of all New Jersey communities. On behalf of our community partners, the Office of the Attorney General, DCR, and our Director, Rachel Weiner-Apter, we thank you for joining us for this important Community Fair Chance and Housing Act overview. DCR is charged with enforcing the New Jersey Law Against Discrimination, the LAD, the New Jersey Family Leave Act, the Fair Chance and Housing Act, as well as preventing and eliminating discrimination and bias-based harassment in New Jersey. The mission of DCR is to protect the people of New Jersey from discrimination and harassment, specifically in employment, housing, and public accommodations. DCR's enforcement and legal units have a team of neutral investigators who review complaints of discrimination and biased harassment. Our Strategic Initiatives and Enforcement Unit is a team of attorneys who work to draft statutory amendments and regulations and draft legal guidance documents. One of our newer units, Education and Training, has a team that works proactively to educate the public about the law against discrimination and how to recognize and prevent acts of discrimination and bias. This is done through interactive, virtual, and in-person trainings. And DCR's Community Relations Unit, the CREW, has a team of community relations specialists and a lead mediator who works to prevent acts of discrimination and bias. And we do this through events such as these: resource development, dissemination of information, community engagement, and really talking about matters that really impact communities of color and all areas of the LAD. The CREW is tasked with making sure that we're able to be forefront and center right after civil rights incidents occur, but also be proactive. New rules specifically codify the Fair Chance and Housing Act, which took effect January 1st, 2022. Due to racial disparities in the criminal justice system, practices that restrict housing opportunities for people with criminal histories have disproportionately affected people of color, especially Black people. By signing the Fair Chance and Housing Act into law last year, Governor Phil Murphy furthered our administration's commitment to taking action to dismantle systemic racism and also to talk about disparities. Today, we're going to have a conversation around reducing housing instability that can contribute to recidivism. Tonight's Fair Chance and Housing Act conversation is an event that is sponsored by the Community Relations Unit of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, a proactive outreach and engagement unit that centers community members' needs, crisis response, and preventing acts of discrimination. We do this through collaborative partnerships, referrals, public education, and working directly with impacted communities after civil rights incidents occur. Examples of the initiatives that we put forward include providing presentations, tabling events, planning conferences, town halls, programs to prevent bias and discrimination. And we do this across the entire state of New Jersey, as well as in our schools. Tonight, it gives me great pleasure to present our panelists. And before we do that, I want to make sure that we also let you know that a big portion of our work is centered around trauma-informed practices, community mediation, and restorative justice. We also center our work around listening sessions so community members' voices can be heard. Tonight, we encourage you to also share your stories with us. You can do so by sharing lived experiences via email at communityrelations@njcivilrights.gov. In the chat, you'll see additional resources that are being dropped, as well as our website, our Facebook and Twitter social media accounts at Civil Rights NJ. And we also want to point out that we know that Zoom fatigue is real. We spend many, many hours on Zoom, and it can be tiresome, but we encourage you to be participants and really be in the moment with us tonight. Our panelists have a wealth of information that they would like to share with you. And unfortunately, our communications department is not with us. So our moderator, Jonathan, is wearing many, many hats. He is serving as IT. He is serving as the communications team, the housing lead, and moderator. So if there are any technical glitches, please know that all of the resources are going to be shared with you, as well as the video, the presentation material, and so forth. And the panelists' contact information will also be distributed. On behalf of the OAG, LPS, DCR, and crew, I now turn it over to our community relations specialist and lead mediator, Mr. Jonathan Green. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome everyone. Thank you, Dr. Johnson Fennell, for the introduction. Once again, my name is Jonathan Green and I serve as lead mediator for the Community Relations Unit of the Division on Civil Rights, and I will be your moderator. Tonight, we are here to discuss the Fair Chance in Housing Act. I would like to start out by introducing the panel for tonight's discussion in alphabetical order by last name. Our first panelist is Ms. Renee Kubiatis, who serves as the Anti-Poverty Program Director for New Jersey Citizen Action. The next panelist is Attorney Akil Roper, who is the Senior Vice President and Assistant General Counsel for Legal Services of New Jersey. The final panelist is Mr. James Williams IV, who advocates as the Director of Racial Justice Policy for the Fair Share Housing Center. We will go into our panel discussion and then into a question and answer session after this short presentation in which we first provide. Tonight's presentation is on the Fair Chance in Housing Act. This presentation contains an overview of the Fair Chance in Housing Act and how to file a Fair Chance in Housing Act complaint. Before we go further into the program, we are going to share a brief Fair Chance in Housing Act explainer video.
On Juneteenth, 2021, Governor Murphy signed the Fair Chance in Housing Act, which ensures that people with past involvement in the criminal justice system have a fair shot at accessing safe and affordable housing. Nothing about the FCHA requires housing providers to consider an applicant's criminal history. Previously, a person could be denied access to housing because of a minor past offense, even when the incident didn't result in a conviction or was unrelated to whether the person would make a good neighbor or tenant. People of color bore the brunt of these policies. Due to systemic racism, Black people in New Jersey are 12 times more likely to be incarcerated than white people. Now, the FCHA sets important limits on how housing providers can consider criminal history. Potential tenants can no longer be categorically excluded based on their criminal histories. Generally, a housing provider can only consider criminal history after making a conditional offer. Even then, it can only consider convictions for violent offenses and for other serious offenses within specified timeframes. Certain records, including arrests that do not result in conviction, can never be considered. Housing providers must conduct an individual assessment of each prospective tenant that considers several required factors, including mitigating evidence. Throughout the process, an applicant may provide mitigating evidence, such as evidence of rehabilitation or evidence that their criminal record is inaccurate. Housing providers are required to inform applicants of all of these rights. This is a victory for all New Jerseyans. The Fair Chance in Housing Act is enforced by the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights. DCR's mission is to prevent, eliminate, and remedy discrimination and bias-based harassment in employment, housing, and places of public accommodation throughout New Jersey. Anyone who believes their rights under the FCHA have been violated may file a complaint with DCR within 180 days of the incident. You cannot be subjected to retaliation for filing a complaint or for attempting to exercise your rights under the FCHA.
Now, New Jersey has some of the country's strongest state-level civil rights laws, including the Law Against Discrimination and the Fair Chance in Housing Act. In housing, the Law Against Discrimination and the Fair Chance in Housing Act are in many ways broader than the anti-discrimination protections in the Federal Fair Housing Act. We want to make sure you are aware of the most up-to-date information on the Law Against Discrimination and the Fair Chance in Housing Act. We are in an important national moment where we are all grappling with the consequences of systemic racism and injustice caused by explicit and implicit bias. We hope you use this presentation as an opportunity not just to learn about legal obligations, but to think about how we can all work proactively towards creating equal housing opportunities in New Jersey. Today, nearly 1/3 of the adult population in the United States has a criminal history. Many of these people have been denied housing, though most pose no threat to their communities based on their criminal record alone. Instead, we know criminal history screenings have disproportionately impacted communities of color, LGBTQ+, individuals with disabilities, and other groups who have been over-policed and over-incarcerated. As a result, New Jersey's Fair Chance in Housing Act remedies this form of discrimination by establishing a fair process for consideration of criminal histories during the application process. Nothing in the Fair Chance in Housing Act requires housing providers to consider an applicant's criminal history. And I'm going to repeat that. There is nothing in the Fair Chance in Housing Act that requires housing providers to consider an applicant's criminal history. Instead, if they choose to do so, they have to follow the processes and guidelines laid out under the Fair Chance in Housing Act and its rules. And the Fair Chance in Housing Act does establish restrictions for housing providers in their consideration of an applicant's criminal histories during the application process. The act is effective as of January 1st, 2022, and it applies to rental dwelling units except owner-occupied units of fewer than 4 units. Only if a housing provider chooses to use past criminal history after a conditional offer is there an explicit prohibition on inquiring into criminal history on initial application materials or advertising, except in limited circumstances. These circumstances include conviction for drug-related criminal activity for the manufacture or production of methamphetamine on the premises of federally assisted housing. Also, persons who are subject to a lifetime registration on a state sex offender registry. Housing providers can never ask the tenant about certain types of records, which these types of records include arrests or charges that have not resulted in a criminal conviction, expunged convictions, convictions erased through executive pardon, vacated and otherwise legally nullified convictions, juvenile adjudications of delinquency, and sealed records. The housing provider must provide a disclosure statement indicating that they intend to consider the applicant's criminal history as permitted under the Act and allowing the applicant the opportunity to provide evidence of inaccuracies in the criminal record, rehabilitation, or other mitigating factors such as found in the model disclosure statement available on DCR's website. The housing provider cannot accept any application fee before providing such a disclosure statement if they intend to consider criminal history under the Act. After a conditional offer, landlords are still not required to consider a prospective tenant's criminal record. But if they choose to do so, they can only consider certain specified types of criminal histories in making a final housing offer. These include murder, aggravated sexual assault, kidnapping, arson, human trafficking, sexual assault, endangering the welfare of a child according to state statute. Any crime that requires lifetime state sex offender registration, along with any conviction or release from prison for a first-degree indictable offense within the past 6 years, any conviction or release from prison for a second or third-degree indictable offense within the past 4 years, and any conviction or release from prison for a fourth-degree indictable offense within the past 1 year. For more guidance on interpreting these types of records, find more information at the link which will be provided in the chat feature. If the housing provider conducts a criminal background check and decides to withdraw a conditional offer of housing because of an offense in the applicant's background, they must provide a notice of withdrawal, indicating the specific reasons and providing an opportunity to appeal, such as found in the model notice of withdrawal available on the DCR website. The housing provider must perform an individualized assessment based on several factors, which include the nature and severity of the offense, the applicant's age, and the time at the time of the offense, how recently the offense occurred, any information the applicant provided in their favor since the offense, if the offense happened again in the future, whether that would impact the safety of other tenants or property, and whether the offense happened on or was connected to property that the applicant rented or leased. After a withdrawal, the law still affords the applicant opportunities to appeal and provide further evidence in explaining why they should not be rejected on that basis. DCR further clarified the law with the rules and regulations published on January 3rd, 2022. A housing provider also cannot disclose or disseminate any criminal history information to anyone else except in ways provided for under the Fair Chance in Housing Act. If an applicant believes they have been subjected to a violation of the Fair Chance in Housing Act, they can file a complaint with DCR under the processes we will go over at the end of this presentation. Once a complaint has been filed, DCR will contact the housing provider to offer them a 14-day period to cure the violation through an informal mediation process. If they cure within that time frame, the complaint will be deemed resolved. If they do not cure within that time period, then DCR will undertake the usual information request and, if necessary, investigative process to determine whether the FCHA has been violated. The Fair Chance in Housing Act flowchart provides an overview of terms and definitions along with the steps and processes related to the Fair Chance in Housing Act. There are 2 pages of this flowchart, which the overview of the phases of page 1 are advertising, an overview of the initial application phase, and the conditional offer. The flowchart, both pages, can be found in the resource document. The flowchart displays the overview of the additional phases on page 2, which include after a conditional offer and an overview of the flowchart for the individualized assessment, as well as the optional withdrawal of conditional offer. Also, the Division on Civil Rights website does have a new look, but it is in the same location. Visit us at www.njcivilrights.gov. And to file a Fair Chance in Housing Act complaint with the Division on Civil Rights, you must submit an intake form on NJ Bias at bias.njcivilrights.gov or by calling 1-833-NJ-DCR-4U or calling the housing hotline at 1-866-405-3050. Please note that retaliation is prohibited, and the statute of limitations to file a complaint with DCR is the same 180 days as in the law against discrimination. A how to file in Fair Chance in Housing Act complaint walkthrough will be completed during the question and answer session of this program. The Education and Training Unit offers an interactive webinar which provides an overview of the Fair Chance in Housing Act to include effective implementation strategies and model forms that can be utilized by housing providers. Participants will also explore how criminal history screenings have disproportionately impacted communities of color and other groups who have been over-policed and over-incarcerated, and consider how housing stability strengthens civil society for all. The dates for the training are February 8th, March 10th, and April 12th. You can register at bit.ly/DCR trainings. The New Jersey Wealth Disparities Task Force Housing Working Group will be holding a listening session to hear from the community about how issues related to housing are related to longstanding wealth disparities for Black and Latinx New Jerseyans. The working group is looking at how home ownership rates and access to stable housing can create wealth disparities and what housing-related policies may address these disparities. Also, please visit us at www.njcivilrights.gov/FCHA. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Civil Rights NJ and use the hashtag Civil Rights NJ and no hate in this great state. Also, you can email us at fchainfo@njcivilrights.gov. And once again, the housing discrimination hotline is 1-866-405-3050. And I would also like to thank you for your attentiveness. Before going into the panel discussion, I want to extend an additional thank you to the Strategic Initiatives Enforcement Unit and the Education and Training Unit for their work and contributions to this overview. And now for our panelists. Once again, I would like to welcome each of you tonight and thank you for bringing your insight into what the Fair Chance in Housing Act means for the state of New Jersey. Mr. Williams, I would like to start with you. From your area of expertise, what is the significance in the Fair Chance in Housing Act?
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you for all that have taken time out of this evening to participate in this really important discussion. I want to thank the Division on Civil Rights for being such a gracious host for this conversation, but also for being such a powerful advocate and partner in this space as well. So Fair Share Housing Center in 1970s, we established what many would call some of the strongest affordable housing, legislation in the country, which we affectionately call our Mount Laurel Doctrine here in the state of New Jersey. That created a mechanism to ensure that all municipalities had a affordable housing set aside. So as we move forward in not getting too historical about Fair Share in particular, the goal is to ensure that, one, there are affordable housing opportunities throughout New Jersey. The next step is to ensure that the appropriate people have access to that housing. So at Fair Share, we've had a lot of success in ensuring that every municipality in the state is meeting their fair share obligation. But to evolve what Mount Laurel is to ensure now that those who need it the most actually have access. You highlighted there that there is a wealth disparity task force here in the state of New Jersey, because we recognize that New Jersey is a very, very expensive state. And we're finding more and more that communities of color are finding it more and more difficult to survive here in the state. And part of that is housing. So if we identify one of the mechanisms that individuals utilize to create and gain wealth, that is through housing. So before someone can purchase a home, they have to have access to affordable housing so that they actually can save and start that process. So mitigating the barriers on the front end to affordable housing is, in a sense, creating access to generational wealth, because that family that lives in that affordable housing user for 5 years, 10 years maybe, is able to put that money aside and start to create that pot that creates that down payment. That down payment becomes that house purchase. That house purchase in an area of equity becomes the mechanism to send their children to college. That college graduate then comes back and works for the Division on Civil Rights. And now we see that cycle of progress. Now we see that generational change. And it all started with having access to housing. In this bill in particular, we know that New Jersey unfortunately has a deplorable #1 ranking of higher racial disparities in the country. So how do we ensure that, in particular, communities of color are getting access to housing as formerly incarcerated people are returning home at exceptionally high rates? So this bill ties squarely into the historical context of what Mount Laurel was designed to do, to give access to housing to everyone in New Jersey, but those that need it the most. And historically, not only in New Jersey, in this country, it has been communities of color.
And thank you for that. I want to ask Ms. Kubiadis the same question. From your area of expertise and from the angle in which your organization, New Jersey Citizen Action, addresses these types of issues, what is the significance in the Fair Chance in Housing Act?
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you to the Division on Civil Rights and the Attorney General's Office for hosting this event, for the great work that you're doing, and to my fellow panelists for the excellent work they do to protect renters, including helping to pass this law with James. I think it's a huge boost, like James said, to ensuring basic human rights for everyone. It further solidifies the right to housing for all. And mainly it's all that you and James shared to provide a much fairer chance at decent housing for returning citizens. I wanted to just briefly touch on something else that I've seen in my 20 years of working alongside poor and homeless people as an ally. You know, the issue of poor people and people of color ingraining these larger societal views of them as people, you know, can be changed with this law as well. So, you know, our general US view is people struggling economically are lazy, uneducated, have made wrong choices or done bad things in life, right? And then ignores the fact that what may be a bad choice for you and or me may be the best option available to somebody else who's had barriers placed in their way all along throughout their life, right? And people begin to believe these other views of themselves, that they don't deserve decent, safe, and sanitary housing, and just accept whatever they can get, even if it's substandard and dangerous. You know, I grew up in poverty in Camden County and know this firsthand, in addition to working alongside people, like I said. However, when our laws recognize the dignity and worth of people, of every person who have paid their debt to society, we begin to change the larger view. And we can also, with this law, arm renters with the information and tools to fight for their rights through the provisions in this law.
Okay, thank you for that. And you mentioned a person having paid their debt to society. I want to note that just because and come back to that, but I want to first allow Attorney Roper, if you would answer the question as far as what is the significance in the Fair Chance in Housing Act in relation to Legal Service of New Jersey's work?
Thank you, John, for the opportunity, for the invite. Thank you to the D Division for holding the forum. Thank you for the Attorney General's office for likewise allowing this to go forward. And thank you to the esteemed panelists that are sitting here today. I'm honored and grateful to be here and to hope to continue the good work that's been started here already. What I can say is I would join the comments that James and Renee shared, and also you, John, in setting the table with respect to the racial disproportionality, the way we treat folks who have been affected by the justice system in various ways, being victimized by it as well. Impoverished communities, people of color, facing barriers that are seemingly insurmountable. New Jersey is a great state, but we also face a number of challenges, and some of these were alluded to: the income and wealth gap, strict racial disproportionality. But this particular law, I think, shines a light on some areas where we can make some improvements. And I think specifically, there's some things in the new law which I think we can look to. One of the things that I would like to highlight is that the review here for housing agencies, when they're looking at these records, is limited to crimes. So minor offenses, as I read the law, they can't be included in any type of analysis. And frequently we see our clients who have lower level offenses, disorderly persons, municipal ordinance violations, and those are being held against them in terms of finding opportunities. Either it's opportunities with housing or it's employment, various areas. So it's one of the things that we appreciate in that. But giving recognition that this is a new law, we're still waiting to see how the impact is going to directly impact our clients. Now we can think about some areas where we're likely to see some issues going forward in terms of violations. When employers are when housing agencies are violating the law, making sure we are aware when it happens. In the employment space, for example, some clients would get denied and they would just move along rather than pressing forward for a complaint. And we think that's significant, so we have to keep our eye on that. The individualized assessments we think are significant. Not only is it providing an opportunity to get beyond the traditional ban the box, which previously created a barrier, and is an attempt to get past the the concept where a decision maker could look at a sheet of paper that has a checkbox checked off on it, and they just crumple up the application and throw it in the garbage. Moving beyond that requires an individualized assessment, and it requires a decision that's slowed down. And what we know about implicit bias and unconscious bias is that a lot of the impact there can set in when you're making these snap decisions. So it's very important that that piece is in there also. In addition to the public safety issues as well, it's very significant for public safety and for folks who are trying to get a fair opportunity for housing. And that impacts not only individuals who may be justice impacted, but they're also their families as well, because most of the folks that we are assisting, they've got family members, they've got children. So it's very significant in that regards as well.
Okay, thank you. And I did want to touch back on that note that I made as far as the debt being paid to society and ask a question around that. And really, I want this, I know, Ms. Kubiadis, you made that statement, but it really goes to any of you as the panelists, and feel free to chime in. But do you believe with the Fair Chance in Housing Act in place that it helps further the notion that a person with a past criminal history has paid their debt to society?
I'll kick it off. I think when formerly incarcerated people are they're returning home, we say that they have a new lease on life. They have a new chance. But what is life without opportunity? Existence. They've served their time, and in return, we offer them mere existence. They don't have a fair opportunity at employment. They don't have access to credit and capital. They don't have access to the most fundamental human right, which is housing. Many of us that have worked and coordinated with formerly incarcerated people will tell you fundamentally that if you offer a person that is coming home access to a job, housing, and services, that the likelihood that they'll recidivate drops exponentially. So paying their debt means just that. The fact that we're tying the criminal justice system to housing is fundamentally wrong. Advocates here in the state, our partners, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, some years ago decoupled democracy and the criminal justice system. So here now, we must do the same thing. So if you've paid that quote unquote fundamental debt to society, we need to decouple the criminal justice system from housing. Because once again, if I don't offer you opportunity with this new lease on life, I've only created an opportunity for you to exist and not actually live.
Okay. No, and thank you for that response. Did anyone else want to kind of touch on that, or I did have another question for you? All right.
I would just add, John, I agree with James 100%. It's interesting because a lot of the what we see around in the reentry space is this waiting period. So in order for someone to be able to have a fair opportunity for housing, to clear their record for employment, they have to wait the period of time to prove that they've been rehabilitated and they're fit somehow for opportunities. But the irony is that those who are just released, those are the folks who need opportunities, and that's where a lot of the focus should be. So an individual has paid his debt as soon as his sentence is over. But instead, we're seeing a lot of people who are facing collateral consequences that linger. We've seen folks who have arrest records from 20 years ago, 40 years ago, and it's still causing them issues with respect to various pursuits, including housing. So I agree with James. We really need to rethink the way we treat folks who have been justice affected, because again, it's not only individuals, but it's families, it's communities. We talk about recidivism, and it's important for us to think about that. But the reality is that most individuals who have a criminal conviction do not get another criminal conviction. They talk about a recidivism rate around 30%, and it gets a lot of attention. But let's also pay attention to the fact that public safety has not been harmed in many respects with respect to a lot of the reentry efforts that have taken place. Under the new law, where public health credits were issued to folks who during the pandemic in facilities who were lower risk or near release. Thousands of were let out from prisons and jails, and nothing happened, right? There wasn't this huge surge or uptick in violence and people running the streets. So I think that it's an opportunity for us, this law, other laws like it, that give a real opportunity for folks who have served sentences and who no longer need to be maltreated by systems that don't respect and provide opportunities to folks when they really need it.
And did you want to touch on any of that, Ms. Kubiatis? Or
No, I'll just concur with both James and Akil.
no, I appreciate that. I did want to ask, because I did hear Mr. Williams and Attorney Roper mention recidivism. And for people who may not be familiar with that term at home, could someone explain exactly what recidivism means? Attorney Roper or Renee, either.
Sure. Well, I mean, in short, recidivism means an individual who has reoffended. So it's another offense after one has been convicted, either in terms of another conviction or being sent back to prison or incarceration.
Okay.
And it is in many respects a measure of how we look at the effectiveness of an individual's rehabilitation or a group of people's rehabilitation by looking at a lens of recidivism, and what is the likelihood and the percentage of those folks who are returning back to either prison or have gotten another conviction.
And thank you for that clarification, Attorney Roper, and I apologize for that. Ms. Kubiatis, was there anything you wanted to add to that, or did that kind of clarify?
Yeah, I didn't want to add anything, but I also wanted to just kind of speak to recidivism in general.
Yeah.
If that's okay.
Yeah, most definitely.
As you shared earlier, Jonathan, a third of the U.S. population has a criminal history. That's a significant chunk of everyone in our country. And without housing or access to decent housing, a person doesn't have that critical foundation of a safe space to lay their head to keep other basic needs met. Especially with the barriers to accessing those necessities, like James mentioned, getting a job and not being able to have a fair chance of those kinds of things as well. I'll just share a brief story of someone I know, an ally in the work that we do at Citizen Action, who is in and out of prison over a period of years. The last time he was incarcerated, came out to try and be a father to his 3-year-old son, and he wound up homeless with his young son. He was denied assistance, denied access to housing, and so he moved into a vacant property for a little while and told neighbors at first that he bought the home because he was ashamed, right? But he needed housing, right? Like every person deserves housing. And doing that is clearly illegal. But when people are desperate, they may violate existing laws in desperation to meet their basic needs when those barriers and lack of opportunity rule their world. Indeed, the reason they were convicted of a crime initially may have been related to what I call being in survival mode, right? In generational poverty or just poverty in general at some point. And academics use this term of criminalizing poverty, but it's really a misnomer because in fact, we are actually criminalizing people who are poor. We're not criminalizing poverty, right? We're criminalizing actual people. And as James said, we need this law in New Jersey to ensure that everyone has a fair chance at accessing decent, safe, and affordable housing in our state.
No, and thank you for that insight. Excuse me. And you kind of touched on my next question. And Ms. Kubiatis, I want to start with you with this question again. And if you feel you answered it based on how you just responded, I understand. But I was going to ask, how does not having adequate housing cause higher rates of recidivism?
Well, just as I said, like not having housing, it makes it that much harder to go out and look for a job and manage family and manage transportation and manage all of the other things in our lives, right? And I think, you know, it is one of the worst crises of not having a basic necessity met in terms of your overall mental health and the trauma that it can cause. And just make it that much more difficult in the human condition. If we talk about, you know, many of us who took a psychology or social work course, I'm a social worker in college, you know, we learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And that safe space, right, to rest your head is at the very foundation of that pyramid from Maslow, right? And we can't do anything else unless we have that sense of security, right?
And thank you for that additional response into that aspect. Attorney Roper, I want to give you that same question. From your point of view, how does not having adequate housing cause higher rates of recidivism?
John, there's clear linkages. And so there's a number of studies that'll show you that stable housing post-release leads to less recidivism. These are studies that were conducted in metropolitan areas. There was a study in Chicago. There was a study in New York who found that returning folks found that living in shelters had an increased recidivism rate. Individuals in Chicago having their own apartment or their own house 2 months post-release, those individuals faced a lower risk of recidivism. And so, you know, sometimes we think about stable reentry and employment being sort of the linchpin of that, in the sense that folks are now self-sufficient and taking care of their needs and helping support a family. But logically, before you get there, you need housing. And that's one of the first crucial needs that that you have. And others have talked about this. I mean, the options for folks who are low income, it's very challenging. When folks are released, if their family relations have strained, if they don't have options, the private housing markets are out of range. Transitional housing, there's some opportunities there, but it's of a limited supply. Subsidized and public housing, it's similar. They can provide some opportunities. But for many of our clients, it's shelters and homelessness, and that's sort of a reality, an unfortunate reality. And so when Renee is talking about the link between homelessness and incarceration and the criminalization of poverty, those things are real. You know, we have clients with offenses like theft and shoplifting, prostitution. We see these types of offenses, and frequently there's symptoms of poverty and homelessness and housing instability. So it's a major issue. And so I think this law takes some steps to try to provide some opportunities for folks in terms of housing, because it's crucial.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Williams, I want to ask you as well, from the work in which Fair Share Housing advocates for, and the work in which you just are involved in and fight so hard for, how does not having adequate housing cause people to reoffend?
I think Renee highlighted a key point. When we visualize someone returning home, we think of probably a single male, but these are mothers that are returning home. These are fathers. The reunification of family is essential for many of these individuals. In the most indiscriminatory occupational industry on this planet is crime. So when we eliminate opportunities from individuals, crime becomes a very, very present option. When we take away those legal means that people are striving to actually accomplish, then these other opportunities then insert themselves, and they're married together with housing and employment. All these things walk side by side. So with housing, you have a higher likelihood of finding, to Renee's point, that good, stable, secure job. You have that place to lay your head each and every night. You have that place to lobby with the courts to reunify your family. You have that place to iron your clothes, to cook a good meal, to go through your job applications. Like, all of these things are essential for you to make that next step. And if we take that away, if we remove those options from individuals, particularly people of color that are probably returning back to our urban epicenters, what's available? What's available going back to Attorney Roper's options? What are available to these individuals that don't want to be homeless? They look for the next best thing. And if crime is an option that they can utilize to keep a roof over their head, to find, a way to put a couple dollars in their pocket, it goes back to Renee's point. In to a certain extent, that's not a crime, it's survival. And that survival instinct has been activated because we've placed barriers in these individuals' lives that don't allow them to take the necessary steps that we residents of this state promised them when they returned home.
Okay, and thank you for that insight. And it's a lot of information we're taking here. And one thing I noted was Mr. Williams and Ms. Kubiatis. Mr. Williams, you noted survival, and Ms. Kubiatis, you noted people being in survival mode. I want to ask, and I'll start with Attorney Roper. How can the lack of housing cause an increase in the trauma a person experiences?
That's a great question, and I'm probably not the best suited to answer this question, but what I can tell you is through my observations, through dealing with folks who have had issues, it's pretty stressful to not be able to have a stable situation. And as Renee and James talked about, I think about the impacts on children who are going through instability with housing. I mean, it disrupts their school. They may be taken out, jumping from school to school. It'll affect their academics. It'll affect your job if you have to move from place to place. And you have to keep in mind that many folks who are low income, they can't just hop in their car and decide to go to a job opportunity that's a few counties away. They're relying often on public transportation. Transportation may not be available in certain areas. So all of that just adds to the levels of stress that individuals who are facing poverty or discrimination, they have to deal with it. And it's unfortunate. It's just another burden. And so, of course, that's trauma. You look at individuals who are supporting their families. They have elder folks living with them, the folks who may have disabilities, people who are counting on folks. So sure, that from my observed experience, I can see that creating a host of trauma that perpetuates. And so it really is a shame, but also an opportunity, I hope, to refocus on these issues related to poverty, discrimination, and try to create some changes as this law is doing.
Thank you. Excuse me. Mr. Williams, I want to ask you from your perspective, how can the lack of housing cause an increase in trauma a person experiences?
Oh, wow. That's a pretty complex list. Desperation, anxiety, depression. I mean, you think about it, just the idea of of going from sleeping on someone's couch one day to the floor the next, to a bed the next, to a car the next, to a park bench the next. What that does, and when we say trauma, there's physical trauma that can occur. Some individuals, particularly, once again, let's broaden our thinking of the individuals we're thinking of. These could potentially be women that could have to subject themselves to living in unsafe, unsecure locations just so that they're not sleeping on the street. These are fathers, to Renee's point, that are trying to reunify with their children and sleeping in abandoned buildings. So there's emotional and physical trauma that could be perpetual for these situations. You know, what does it mean for a child to every day they come home from school to not know where they're going to sleep? What does that mean for that individual that's trying to be gainfully employed? And the moment that you clock out, you had a great day, you worked hard. Now the next step is to, where will I sleep? Where will I shower? Where will I eat? You know, those are things that are very, very trying on an individual, and they start to bring about not only like mental health issues, but those manifest themselves in physiological issues. You start to see people with high blood pressure. You start to see people with hypertension. So these are things that exist for these individuals, and it causes a way of life that's not healthy. It causes a way of life that actually leads these individuals to have higher risk of death. So housing insecurity can lead to a very, very unfortunate dark road for a lot of people. So not only mentally, but also physically.
Thank you for that. That was very, brought some understanding to us various situations and put perspective on just, I think a key takeaway so far is just expanding our view of what inadequate housing looks like and the states of homelessness look like. So Ms. Kubiadis, I want to ask you that same question.
Yeah, and I just say amen to everything Akil and James just said. They really, just touched on everything. And I'll lift up what my friend Manira put in the chat. Yes, it causes a ripple effect, right? And when James was just speaking, it actually made me think of my mentor, who is a formerly homeless Black man and organizer across the nation with poor people. That years ago, we had a meeting at my rental house that I was in, a townhome at the time, and he was staying in a place in Philadelphia with several other families. And he just said, coming to your home made me realize and really set in stone for me that I have no peace in my life, right? Like, I'm always worried about what other people are doing, what's going to happen, like working on other people's schedules. And James was talking about this, the moving around from couch to couch, or, whatever, if you don't have a stable place to be, and just not having that sense of peace ever. If you don't have a home of your own by yourself or with your family. And we've touched a lot on the interconnections and needs, but there's, shame, isolation, depression. I think James touched on some of that as well. And as a social worker, I've been asking a question for 20 years of like, how many people in the US are on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications simply because of their economic situation, right? And finally, in the last few years, there is national research showing this connection, certainly. But as I said earlier, not having a stable housing is a significant physical, emotional, and psychological trauma that is hard to overcome and hard to then focus on anything else in your life.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Wow. This just the impact of the Fair Chance in Housing Act seems, just from how all of the perspectives in which you're outlining, it really places the importance of the Fair Chance in Housing Act in my view. I did also want to ask Mr. Williams, can individuals report to your organization if they are denied housing based on a criminal record, or should they report directly to the Division on Civil Rights?
Uh, great question, and it's um, we should not be the reporting agency. The Division on Civil Rights has championed and in their own right advocated to own this piece of legislation under their enforcement portfolio. So we are happy to continue to be an advocate, to work with DCR and the Attorney General's office, fellow partners like Renee and Akil to elevate these issues and to as we hear about these cases, identify ways that we can improve this bill. But going back to your original question, Fair Share Housing should not be the reporting agency. It should be the Division on Civil Rights. But if a community member doesn't know how, or if they have, and I don't see an opportunity or situation where you guys aren't available, if you do reach out to us, we will be a vehicle to reach out to yourself and the other members of your team to make sure that this is investigated properly, because you are a law enforcement agency. You do bring that investigative authority to the situation. So Fair Share is not who you should be reaching out to, but if you do, we will continue to advocate for anybody that reaches out to our organization.
Thank you for your continued advocacy and that direction to our various communities. Attorney Roper, can individuals report to your organization if denied housing based on a criminal record, or should they directly report to DCR as well?
DCR is the enforcement agency that receives complaints, but legal services and the legal services system is always here to help individuals through their issues with respect to any civil legal issue that they may have at any stage. We have attorneys ready to assist folks in all 21 counties. There's Northeast New Jersey Legal Services, Legal Services of Northwest New Jersey, Essex Newark Legal Services, Central Jersey Legal Services, South Jersey Legal Services, and my organization, Legal Services of New Jersey. And we operate as a statewide system to provide assistance for folks. And if folks can't get assistance in terms of representation from the regional program offices, they can contact us. We have a toll-free hotline that is online as well, so they can have an online intake system, or they can call our hotline, which is 1-888-LSNJ-LAW, or they can reach us on the website, lsnjlaw.org. If they do have a civil legal issue, we encourage that. We are the system that provides legal services for folks. So we absolutely have an open doors, and we're ready to assist to the extent we can. And as James said, we are also involved in some of the advocacy, and we welcome the opportunities to further collaborate, to support DCR, and support James and Renee's organizations, and hope to continue to collaborate. And as we find issues and try to come to some resolution and resolve issues that are facing the community.
Thank you. And Ms. Kubiatis.
Again, first of all, the Division of Civil Rights is where complaints should be filed and information brought. But in addition, New Jersey Citizen Action is a HUD designated fair housing investigation agency, and we offer fair housing counseling services for anyone who feels they may have been discriminated against the new Fair Chance in Housing law or the longstanding law against discrimination as well. And I believe the information to contact us for help is in the chat. And I would say, especially for somebody like who doesn't have access to adequate technology or needs help to kind of file that complaint, they can certainly reach out to us.
Okay, and I really appreciate each of your responses. I think I pretty much knew that as far as the Division on Civil Rights being that enforcement agency, but I just wanted to more so see what avenues people in the community had just who reach out to you, and because you don't take those intakes to be able to file complaints, really giving people that resource of how you're able to best help them. So thank each of you for answering that in the way in which you did. One thing that's kind of been, I want to touch on kind of before we wrap up our panel discussion this evening is I heard Mr. Williams mention statement about credit earlier. And I was just wondering, and this can go out to anyone, but Mr. Williams, feel free. How do credit histories pose a barrier to having access to housing?
Ooh, we're gonna stay on this Zoom for a while then. Credit, like criminal background, like lawful income, like race and religion, are all identified as critical barriers for housing in means that which individuals have been discriminated against. But credit in particular, some landlords and developers use third-party screening agencies where they set a ceiling or a benchmark for what they feel to be an appropriate credit score for an individual to come into these units, particularly around affordable housing, which Fair Share has worked very intimately in. Is if you put a threshold on credit scores for affordable housing, these are individuals that are looking to that may low to moderate income, probably looking to establish credit. If I don't have any credit and you won't let me establish credit, how does that ever happen? If I can't get into a unit where that would help me to establish credit because you set the benchmark at 650 or 680, and in most cases, individuals that have those kind of credit scores have access to more capital and probably won't be in need of affordable housing. So credit acts as another ceiling, another barrier for individuals, particularly that are looking to get into affordable housing, because those are the individuals that probably make low to moderate incomes, have less access to capital, and are looking to find a way to establish credit, establish savings, and through that affordable housing unit, gain the kind of financial wealth that would allow them to make that next step, hopefully into home ownership. So credit, like the other factors that I outlined, plays a huge role in, once again, starting the ball on that, reducing that wealth disparity. How do we get that going? So I'm sorry, I see that you wanted to insert yourself.
No, I apologize for the interruption. It's just in correlation to recidivism rates, the conversation we had earlier, is there a correlation between recidivism and those just the access to housing based on lower credit scores? That, to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, now I'm certain that there probably have been some corollary studies that look at that credit scores and access to housing. But if we look at credit scores as a means of access to wealth and what that looks like in terms of access to housing, then yes, there are corollaries between your debt to your net asset worth and recidivism being, once again, your opportunity to gain and create wealth for you and your family. So not having credit, not having a what some would seem to be a suitable credit score, then reduces your opportunity to housing. And once again, Renee highlighted that she's a social worker, academically trained as a sociologist. We look at what fits into that void when society doesn't provide opportunity. And in most cases, it will be crime, particularly for the individuals that we're talking about that are returning home. And a lot of them, once again, are Black and brown individuals going back to Camden, going back to Atlantic City, going back to Trenton, Newark, Jersey City, Irvington, Patterson, a lot of our hyper concentration of urban areas where opportunities, and we're starting to see the housing markets in these particular areas become more and more expensive. So if you don't have the credit, you don't have the capital, you don't have housing, then what do you do? So it does go back to the statement that was put into the chat. Not having access to credit then becomes a ripple effect into your recidivism rates, because their opportunity doesn't exist for them to live within what we would deem to be the societal norms.
No, and thank you for just that breakdown. I think it is very important in highlighting just having access to safe and affordable housing, and being able to see how best the Fair Chance in Housing Act can really give that foundation. It's funny, we talk about housing, and having that foundation of the Fair Chance in Housing Act be such a staple in moving this initiative forward of eliminating bias and discrimination. I think is very important. I want to thank each of the panelists for all of the wealth of knowledge in which they were able to provide tonight in helping us to understand the effect of the Fair Chance in Housing Act. And at this time, we have reached the question and answer section of our program. The first question we want to address is how to file a Fair Chance in Housing Act complaint on NJ bias. And although the steps can be found in the resource document, I want to introduce the bilingual community relations specialist with the Division on Civil Rights, Tisha Leonardo Santiago, to provide the walkthrough.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good evening, everyone. For someone to be able to file on NJ bias, you would just have to visit our website, njcivilrights.gov, and navigate to the File a Civil Rights Complaint. When you get there, you'll see language that will explain what the filing process is with our division. We also have an NJ bias handbook for complainants and respondents. Complainants are the individuals that file a complaint with the office, and respondents are the organizations and entities who receive the complaints if we accept the complaint that falls within our jurisdiction. We also provide a NJ bias tech support for individuals that may be having some technical issues, as well as a phone number, 862-350-5150 for those that need bias support. Once you log into NJ bias, you'll see this welcome screen. Once again, on the bottom, you'll see the manuals in English and in Spanish, along with the contact information. The first thing you want to do is you want to create your own account. So you're going to click on File a Complaint. And these 4 windows are going to pop up for you. I'm sorry, these 6 windows. You're going to navigate to Fair Chance in Housing. And then, since it's your first time being on the website, you're not going to go to sign in. You're going to move to register. You're going to type in a valid email address, create a username, and then create a password, and then re-enter your password and hit register. Once you do that, your first screen within NJ bias will be your profile. Here, you'll select whether or not you want to see electronic service notifications, which is a fancy word for saying emails. And also, if you want to receive notifications from NJ bias via text message, and you would just select the appropriate ones. You'd fill out your contact information and hit update. After you've done that, you want to click on confirmation email, which will be this blue banner. And once you click on the confirmation email, you'll go into your inbox and you'll get an email that tells you confirm your account from a DCR no reply email address. Once you get this email, just click on complete registration, and that will take you back into the portal, which means that now your account is live. you're gonna click on Fair Chance in Housing Act, and that's gonna take you into the intake form. The first page is gonna be your instructions. You're gonna read through this carefully to understand essentially what the process is to filing. And there's also a complaint process. If you want more information, you would click the hyperlink. Once you've read everything, you click I acknowledge and then hit save and next. The second screen is going to be your basic information. We want to know, is it you that's filing for yourself, or are you filing on behalf of someone else? Are you filing, what's your allegation in terms of, are you filing for a Fair Chance in Housing Act, or did you accidentally click on the wrong intake form? Then questions around the type of complaint that you're filing, you would fill that out and then hit save and next. Your next screen is going to be your user information, and all of this information will be pre-filled from your profile. There's going to be an interview section, and there, if you need an accommodation, whether it's an interpreter or any other type of accommodation, you would just identify it here and then hit save and next. Your next screen is going to be the complainant demographics. This screen is completely optional. So if you wish to provide us with your demographics, you're more than welcome to fill that out, but you don't have to. The following screen is where you're going to put any additional contact information. So you'll click, if you wish to be represented by an attorney, you would just click on Add Attorney and fill in their information. If you wanted to add additional contacts, then you would add their information. Please note that we are a state agency and our services are free of charge. So having an attorney is within your discretion and right. Once you've completed the additional complainant parties information, you're going to identify who it is that you want to complain against. So is it a business or organization? Is it an individual? And in some instances, it could be both. You would identify the one that's closest to your situation and then hit save and next. We're going to do the same thing on the respondent screen. If it's an organization that you're complaining against, you're just going to click on organization. You're going to fill in the organization name, phone number, email address, and their physical address. And then hit submit. And then save and next screen. Now, we've gotten to the meat and potatoes as to why you're on NJ Bias. Here, you're going to provide us the intake details. So in what county did this incident occur? What type of respondent, meaning what type of entity you're alleging violated the FCHA? What was the most recent date of harm, which would be your most recent interaction with that entity or individual, and is the harm continuing? The physical address of where the harm occurred. And if you see on the side, it's a pretty long page because of all the multiple options. So I just zoomed in so you can see the different sections. The next question is going to ask you if there are any witnesses that can support your allegation. If you have witnesses, you will just mark this yes and identify them. If you don't have any witnesses, you just leave this blank. Now, there's a series of statements that you would just read through. And for each statement that applies to you, you would mark it off. These are the rest of the statements. And a text box would appear. In that text box, you would describe what occurred as it relates to the statement that you are selecting as closest to your matter. And once you're done, you'll hit save. And then once you're done with this section, you would hit save and next. If you do have any documentation, photographs, audio, so on and so forth, you can go ahead and upload it in the document screen. You would just click on upload and upload it from your computer. This holds up to 15 megabytes. And then you would hit save and next. Now we're to the confirmation page, which says The same thing that your instruction page said. We're just reminding you of what you read in the beginning. You would hit acknowledge, and then you would click submit. Once you've hit submit, you'll get a message that says intake submitted. Thank you for submitting your intake form, and the investigator will be contacting you within 5 working days. If you do not reach this screen, that means that your intake has not been submitted and is still in the draft form. So you always want to be mindful of that, that you get to this intake screen. If you ever do come across an issue in accessing NJ Bias, you're more than welcome to reach out to the division via the information we provided in the chat, and our support staff will reach out and help you in the filing process. We also have the NJ Bias the NJ Bias complainant handbooks, and NJ Bias is also mobile friendly. Do we have any questions?
So, not seeing any directly, one second.
Nope.
Regarding the, not regarding the presentation that you just gave.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much. And I'll turn it right back over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you for that, teacher.
No problem.
At this time, we will begin the public Q&A portion. Please note that we will attempt to answer as many questions as possible. However, for more complex questions submitted and not answered, we will reach out via the contact information provided. Additionally, we cannot offer legal advice in this Q&A. So one of the first questions I want to get to is, I see it here, asking about what penalties do landlords face who violate the FCHA. And I'll kind of take that because in the resource document, which I'm not sure if it has been provided in the link yet or not, but in the final resource document that we will provide all participants here tonight, on page, one second. Yes, the resource document has been provided already, but if you go to page 46 of the resource document, it does list the penalties that are applicable to a housing provider who violates the provisions in this act. So it does outline the various penalties within the document. And it starts at subsection C on that page 46. And just for brevity and reading it to answer that question, there are 3 categories of those penalties, in a sense, where they are an amount not to exceed $1,000 if the housing provider has not committed any prior violation within the 5-year period, ending on the date of the filing of the charge, an amount not to exceed $5,000 if the housing provider has committed one other violation within the 5-year period, ending on the date of the filing of the charge, and an amount not to exceed $10,000 if the housing provider has committed 2 or more other violations within the 7-year period, ending on the date of the filing of the charge. Now, I do want to once again note, we are not giving legal advice. Rather, this is the statute from what was included in the resource document. And for legal advice, please consult a licensed attorney in your state. But also, just following up on some additional questions, one second here. And I apologize for that. I did see another one of the questions that came through as far as Where'd it go? Oh, I do apologize. It was the one that we touched on earlier regarding the enforcement of the Fair Chance and Housing Act. So that does fall under the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights to specifically answer that question that came from the audience. And I'm just going through the Q&A questions here, and ones that are more individualized or require further research as far as the appropriate channel to respond, we will once again contact you. And I do see where the questions have been also being answered along the way. All right, so Tisha, are you seeing any additional questions here? I do apologize. I'm trying.
There are questions regarding the resource document besides the 5 open questions on the Q&A.
Okay, yeah, I see the 5 open. And thank you for that. Will the and some of these that I'm seeing, Tisha, I think are the ones we'll have to respond to on an individual basis. So is there an appeal process for tenants or landlords? Yes, there is an appeal process. Once again, that goes into the appeal process goes into the time for a potential housing provider to cure. So once a alleged complaint comes through, that 14-day window that could possibly be provided depending on the situation. But it would depend, it doesn't depend on whether an appeal could occur. It just depends on the situation in which how the appeal could occur, depending on the intake of the complaint. So one second. How would you describe the role of real estate agents in these situations? So, and I'll kind of touch on this, but if any of the panelists want to, as far as explain how the housing provider, the marketing and advertising of potential wording in an advertisement, how that could be from a real estate agent's perspective if they put certain examples. Would anyone like to explain that?
Sure. So even before Fair Chance and Housing Act, it could be identified as discriminatory to have a listing that says no one with a criminal background check is allowed. So that was before Fair Chance and Housing. So now, even moving forward, there should be a hyper focus on those listing agents, real estate agents, to ensure that when they list a property, that that type of discriminatory language, married along with another initiative that Division of Civil Rights has worked heavily on, like Section 8 vouchers allowed, source of lawful income. So knowing exactly how that could be marketed, and that if that type of language is identified, those are violations of the law. Should work extremely hard with their clients or whomever to ensure that they understand that we are not permitted under New Jersey state law to not only list Section 8 vouchers, but we we can't and should not have ever been having a listing that stated we can no longer no one with a criminal background check accepted. So that shouldn't be an issue. And just to jump up very, very quickly, Fair Chance and Housing Act does not supersede or change any of the HUD guidelines. So HUD guidelines do stay in place. Those federally funded properties do not fall within Fair Chance and Housing. So HUD guidelines, forgive me, are still in place. So there would be no need to update that, as they are they would be the referring agency in that particular case.
Okay, and thank you for answering that. I do want to make just a quick point of clarification before we wrap up here this evening regarding the previous question with appeals of applicants and housing providers, but applicants can appeal housing providers' withdrawal by presenting counter information, but they can also appeal if DCR finds that a complaint is not substantiated. But also housing providers can appeal a final DCR decision that a complaint is substantiated as well. I do want to say at this time, on behalf of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, I want to thank each of the panelists. I want to thank each of you at home and everyone for tuning in to learn more about the Fair Chance and Housing Act. Please remember that the New Jersey Wealth Disparities Task Force Housing Work Group listening session is February 23rd at 6:30 p.m., which more information will come soon. And remember to visit www.njcivilrights.fch www.njcivilrights.gov/FCHA. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Civil Rights NJ using the hashtag Civil Rights NJ and hashtag No Hate in This Great State. Email fchainfo@njcivilrights.gov. The housing discrimination hotline number again is 1-866-405-3050. And once again, everyone have a good evening and thank you.
Thank you guys for having me.